Hello, and welcome to this preview for making a custom belt. In this series of videos, we will go over the process of making a belt to a custom design. Going through the process of laying out a design to carve down the belt, carving the design on the belt, and finishing the belt once we are happy with the design. The stages for making this into the final belt are as follows. Aligning the design. Tracing the design. Cutting along the trace lines. Using the beveler and sculpting tools to raise the pattern. Finishing the edges of the belt, using gum tragacanth and the bone tools. Staining, or dyeing the leather. Sealing the leather before a primer paint layer is added. Applying the primer paint layer. Painting over the primer layer with the final paint color. Sealing the leather with a wax-based sealant. Punching the holes for the belt. Applying press studs and a buckle to make it a functional belt. The design will be generated on the computer, and printed out on paper. Because this is a long pattern, it needs some assembly once printed. Magic tape is used to pin the paper design to the leather. Once happy, water is sprayed on the leather to be able to manipulate it. A tracing tool, in my case, this is a broken needle in a handle, but a ballpoint pen will work the same. Because of the water content now in the leather, the tool used to trace will make a darker line in the leather, and when you look at the leather the pattern will come together. As the video highlights, there is a perspex slab that is under the belt. This serves two main jobs. The first is to remove any bounce back that the bench will give while carving. The second is to let me put a copy of the design underneath and reference back to it. The slab is around 30 mm, which is more than enough to reduce the strikes from the mallet. In order to start cutting the design, the leather needs to be wet again. The tool that is employed this time is called a swivel knife, and in my case, has a ceramic blade. This is not typically how they are bought. Normally a swivel knife will come with a metal blade which needs sharpening, whereas a ceramic blade does not. This is simply a task of following the pattern that was traced and cut along those lines. This requires a little force to get the cut line into the leather, however this is dependent on a lot of factors. With the entire pattern now transferred to the leather, and cut, it's time to get into the task of carving. Before starting, a rough idea of the desired outcome should be kept in mind. This is more important for complex and detailed designs. Examples could include Celtic patterns, animals, or something that is made up of different depths. This design has 42 independent characters that can mostly be treated as their own carving. The main reason for this is there is nothing linking them together. That being said, the font does not help with this carving. What I want to do with this carving is racing all the characters. Being in the Old English font, it would be far easier to sync all of them. This, however, would not look as good. The main problem with the Old English font is all the serifs and little details, which are easy to lose when carving. There are two main tools that I will be using, these being the bevelers and the spoon tool. Where bevelers are available in a lot of different sizes, I typically stick to using two. These are a big beveler and a medium beveler, however this is a small one, in my tools. They are used to push the leather down along cut lines. Depending on which one is used will determine the amount of cleanup needed afterwards. The smallest beveler used gives a harsher fall-off, meaning the use of the spoon and bone folder is needed to remove that harshness. Whereas the big beveler gives a nice smooth fall-off that doesn't require much cleanup. The spoon tool is used most of the time, provided the leather is wet enough to take manual manipulation. This is done by hand and the amount of pressure applied will determine the outcome. Unlike hitting it with a mallet, some strength, both in the fingers and the hand is needed. Now on to staining the belt. I will be using an antique leather stain called saddle tan. This was picked over dyes as the saddle tan finish looks pretty interesting when having colored paint applied next to it. It will also react differently to a dye on leather, as leather is a natural resource, and therefore makes the stain a more unpredictable finish. In order to stain the belt there are some things that are needed. Firstly, we need the stain we are going to use, and secondly, we need a sponge to apply the stain. Gloves are advised so the stain does not go all over your hands. To start staining, I take the sponge and apply some water to it. This makes the stain more fluid. This will help get a nice distribution of stain throughout the leather, and in the carved area, provide a depth of color. With the stain applied, the next part will take some patience. This is because we need to wait for the stain to seep into the leather enough for it to hold the information. After the leather has been standing for enough time, we can move on to the next step, which is removing the surface stain. This is a personal preference, as the longer the stain is left on the leather, the darker the color will turn. This will provide a contrast between the carved and uncarved areas of the belt. We remove the stain in much the same way we apply it. However, instead of a sponge, we will use some tissue, which has been saturated with water. This is done only on the surface of the leather, and nowhere else. We want to bring as much of the stain off as we can, which will make the contrast even more striking. Do keep in mind that this is directly impacted by the time you left the stain on.